Imagine waking up one morning and your entire world, your family, your village, your language, your food, begins to vanish. Not in a war, not in a flood, but silently, invisibly, like smoke rising from a fire you cannot see. That is exactly what began happening to tens of millions of people across North and South America in the years following 1492. And by 1506, just 14 years after Columbus first set foot on Caribbean soil, the destruction was already staggering in scale. Before the Europeans arrived, the Americas were not empty, they were not wild. They were not waiting to be discovered, they were home. Scholars today estimate that between 50 and 100 million people lived across the two continents, a number larger than the entire population of Europe at the time. These were not scattered tribes living in mud huts. These were sophisticated civilizations with cities, roads, trade routes, calendars, and governments. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, sitting in the middle of a lake in what is now Mexico City, had a population of over 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on the planet. The Inca Empire stretched 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, connected by a road system more organized than anything in medieval Europe. In the Mississippi River Valley, enormous earthen mounds rose from the flat landscape, built by thousands of hands over generations. These were living, breathing, thriving worlds. And then the footsteps came. The first contact between Europeans and the indigenous people of the Americas was not a meeting between equals. It was a collision between two worlds that had no knowledge of each other. And that collision would prove catastrophic for one side in ways that no one on either shore could have imagined. By 1506, the island of Hispaniola, the first major place Columbus settled, had already lost the vast majority of its native Taino population. A people who had numbered in the hundreds of thousands were now dying so fast that Spanish priests were writing letters home in horror, unable to explain what they were witnessing. Something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, and it was only the beginning. These were not primitive people living in the past. They were the architects of one of the most complex human worlds ever built. There were no cannons aimed at the villages. There were no armies marching through the forests. The first great killer of the indigenous people of the Americas was something no warrior could fight. Something so small it was invisible to the naked eye: disease. The Europeans who arrived in the Americas carried with them illnesses that their bodies had spent centuries learning to resist: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. For European populations, these were terrible diseases, but survivable ones. For the indigenous people of the Americas, who had never been exposed to any of them, they were absolute catastrophes. When smallpox entered a village for the first time, it did not simply make people sick. It swept through an entire community with terrifying speed, killing between a quarter and a half of everyone it touched, sometimes more. In some regions, the death rate reached 90%. Think about that for a moment. 9 out of every 10 people, gone. Not over a generation, not over a decade, within months. What made this even more devastating was something called herd immunity, and the indigenous people of 1506 had none of it. When a disease kills so many adults so quickly, entire communities lose their farmers, their healers, their leaders, their mothers. Children are left without anyone to feed them. Crops rot in the fields. Knowledge that had been passed down for 1,000 years simply disappears because the people who carried it are gone. By 1506, on the island of Hispaniola, the Taino population had collapsed from an estimated 250,000 to fewer than a few thousand. Bartolomé de las Casas, a young Spanish priest who had arrived in the Caribbean with the colonizers, watched this unfold with his own eyes. He later wrote that the island had been stripped of people with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The disease did not wait for soldiers or ships. It traveled ahead of the Europeans, racing through trade routes and river valleys, killing people who had never even seen a white face. In many parts of the Americas, whole civilizations were already beginning to collapse before a single European boot ever touched their soil. History rarely has villains as invisible as a virus, and rarely has destruction been so complete. In some communities, the dead outnumbered the living so fast that there was no one left to bury them. Disease alone did not write the full story. While invisible killers swept through villages, a very human and very deliberate system was being built to consume whatever the sickness left behind. The Spanish crown, eager to profit from its new territories, had established a system called the encomienda. Under this system, Spanish colonizers, conquistadors, soldiers, minor nobles, were granted authority over a number of indigenous people. In theory, the colonizers were supposed to protect their indigenous workers and teach them Christianity. In practice, the encomienda was slavery dressed in legal language. Indigenous men were sent into gold mines and forced to work in conditions that no human body could long survive. The mines were deep, dark, and airless. Workers had no protective equipment, because no such thing existed. They hauled heavy loads up narrow ladders, breathing in rock dust day after day. Many died underground. Others emerged broken in body and spirit, only to be sent back in. Those who worked the land fared little better. They were forced to grow food for the Spanish colonists, which meant their own families often went hungry. If quotas were not met, punishment was swift and brutal. Bartolomé de las Casas recorded specific atrocities in such graphic detail that his own countrymen accused him of exaggeration, until more witnesses confirmed what he had written. By 1506, the Spanish had established several permanent settlements in the Caribbean. The logic of colonization had taken hold. Land that had belonged to communities for thousands of years was now being carved up and handed to European men who had never set foot on it before. The indigenous people were being transformed from free human beings into property, into resources to be used up. Like the gold they were forced to mine. It is important to understand that many ordinary Spanish colonizers did not think of themselves as monsters. They believed they were doing God's work, bringing civilization to people they genuinely saw as inferior. This is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire story, that catastrophic evil can be committed by people who are entirely convinced they are doing good. The system did not need hatred to function. It only needed indifference. The most dangerous cruelty in history has rarely come from monsters. It has come from ordinary people following ordinary rules. Not everyone was silent. In the middle of this great human catastrophe, there were voices, Spanish voices, remarkably, that rose up and demanded that the world stop and listen. The most extraordinary of these was a man named Bartolomé de las Casas, the same young priest who had watched the Taino die with such horrifying speed. Las Casas had arrived in the Caribbean as a colonizer. He had participated in the system. He had owned enslaved indigenous workers of his own. But somewhere in those early years, something shifted inside him. He began to truly see the people around him, not as obstacles or resources, but as human beings with souls, with families, with feelings that matched his own. He gave up his encomienda. He became a Dominican friar. And then he spent the rest of his long life. He lived to nearly 100 years old, fighting with every tool available to him, including his pen, his voice, and his direct appeals to the Spanish crown, to end what he called the destruction of the Indies. But the indigenous people were not only waiting to be saved by sympathetic outsiders. They resisted. They fled into mountains and forests. They hid their children. They preserved their languages in secret, embedding them in songs and stories and rituals that the Spanish could hear, but could not understand. In some regions, they organized armed rebellions, fighting back against forces that were better equipped, but that they knew on their own terrain. A Taino leader named Hatui had fled from Hispaniola to Cuba, trying to warn the people there about what was coming. He was eventually captured by the Spanish. Before they burned him at the stake, a priest offered him baptism, so that he could go to heaven. Hatchie asked whether Spanish people went to heaven. When the priest said yes, Hatchie said he preferred not to go there. That quiet, devastating response, made by a man facing death, carries more moral clarity than volumes of theological argument. He had seen what the Spanish heaven looked like on earth. He wanted no part of it. Resistance, in the face of overwhelming power, takes many forms. And sometimes, the most powerful form is simply refusing to pretend that wrong is right. A man about to be burned alive made one of the most quietly devastating moral arguments in the history of the Americas. Historians estimate that in the century following 1492, the indigenous population of the Americas fell by somewhere between 50 and 90%. That means, depending on the region, between 1/2 and 9/10 of every person who had been alive before the Europeans arrived was dead within 100 years. The numbers are so large they stop meaning anything. The human mind was not built to feel millions of deaths at once. So let us bring it closer. Think of a village, perhaps 300 people. They have lived in this valley for 20 generations. They know every plant, every animal, every weather pattern. They have a word for the exact color the river turns in autumn. They have songs for planting and songs for mourning and songs for the birth of a child. They have grandmothers who remember the grandmothers of the grandmothers. Now imagine that village in 1506. Smallpox came through 3 years ago. The Spanish arrived last year. Of those 300 people, perhaps 30 remain. The grandmothers are gone. The songs are half remembered. The word for the color of the autumn river exists in only one person's mind, and that person is 70 years old and ill. Multiply that village by tens of thousands. That is what happened to America between 1492 and 1600. What was lost was not merely population. What was lost was irreplaceable knowledge about medicine, about agriculture, about ecology, about how to live in relationship with the land across thousands of different environments. Some of that knowledge has been partially recovered. Much of it is simply gone, as completely as if it had never existed. And yet, and this matters deeply, the indigenous people of the Americas were not extinguished. Despite everything, they survived. Their descendants are alive today, numbering in the tens of millions across North and South America. They are still speaking languages, still practicing traditions, still telling stories that connect them to the world that existed before the footsteps came. The story of 1506 is not just a story of destruction. It is also, remarkably, a story of survival, of people who refuse to disappear, even when every force in the world seemed determined to make them do so. Remember that village. Remember those 30 who remained. They are the reason the story is still being told. A language dies the moment the last person who speaks it takes their final breath, and no library in the world can bring it back.